the real God only reveals himself to one, who can no longer be described or named at all. If I were to explain its true meaning, you would stone me for being an unbeliever. Ibn Arabi delineates two fundamental and complementary facets of the spiritual way. On the one hand, the belief in and knowledge of how things are in reality, based on the premise of God's unity and the ways that he has revealed himself from time immemorial, the destination and aim, and on the other hand, the practice, the means of achieving the aim, which starts from where each person finds themselves, ignorant of reality, not yet having arrived. Ibn Arabi's spiritual method tends to be built more upon dialectic and paradox. For example, his attitude is revealed in the way he speaks of an encounter with two of his masters in Al-Andalus during his youth. I was once in Seville with my master, Abu al-Abbas al-Uryani, and he said to me, "My son, concern yourself with your Lord." I left his house exhilarated, reeling under the effect of the teaching he had given me. I then went to see my master Abu Imran Musa in his mosque, where he was imam, which was called the Mosque of Al-Rida. I greeted him and he welcomed me, and then he said, "My son, concern yourself with your soul, nafs." So I said to him, "Master, you have told me to concern myself with my soul, while our master Ahmad al-Uryani told me, concern yourself with your Lord. What am I to do?" He replied, "My son, each of us instructs you according to the requirements of his own spiritual state, but what the master Abu al-Abbas has indicated to you is preferable, and may God grant us that." Then I went back to al-Uryani and told him what had happened. He said to me, "My dear child, both points of view are correct. Abu Imran has spoken to you about the beginning and the way to follow, while I have drawn your attention to the final end of the quest, the divine companion who is ever present, so that when you follow the way, your spiritual aspiration will be raised higher than that, which is other than God." This dual approach is very characteristic of Ibn Arabi's teaching, and he plays with the two rhyming terms, the spiritual way, tariq, and divine companion, rafiq, to show that they are inextricably linked. God is simultaneously ever present and the end point of the spiritual journey. Keeping this dual approach of Ibn Arabi's teachings, we have split this video into two parts. The first part includes the background and information about his book, The Adornment of the Spiritually Transformed, Hilyat al-Abdal, while the second part is the exact translation of Ibn Arabi's writing in this book, including the 4 pillars of spiritual transformation. The wise make spiritual discipline, abandonment of this world, and other such things the primary condition for their thoughts to be free enough to receive spiritual matters. For spiritual things do not impart their effects unless the place of reception is emptied, made ready, and turned towards their standpoint of view. Those who know God know that the relationship of all things to God is but one single relation. Thus they witness him in everything, and nothing veils them from him. When Ibn Arabi began to devote himself in earnest to the spiritual way in the year 1184, he frequented several different spiritual masters in Seville. Amongst them were a number who had been disciples of Ibn Mujahid, one of the most famous Sufis of the day. Ibn Mujahid's creed was based upon the following hadith of the Prophet: "Reckon with yourselves before you are brought to the reckoning on the day of judgment." He would make a note of all his thoughts, actions, words, what he had heard, and similar things. After the prayer of nightfall, he would seclude himself in his room and go over all his actions of that day that demanded repentance, and repented of them. He would do likewise with all that called for his gratitude. He would then compare his actions with what was required of him by the sacred law. Having done this, he would sleep a little, after which he would rise to say his litanies, wired, and pray in accordance with the custom of the Prophet. Thus, he would sleep and pray alternately throughout the night. According to Ibn Arabi, this Shaykh was once visited by the Almohad Sultan, Abu Yaqub, who asked him whether he ever felt lonely living on his own. He replied, "Intimacy with God abolishes all loneliness. How can I be alone when He is always present with me?" Ibn Arabi himself followed Ibn Mujahid's teachings on self-discipline and states that he benefited immensely from those who had been taught by him. The value of such self-discipline lies solely in its being directed towards an aim, reality alone, as it is in itself. It is clear that in the case of Ibn Mujahid, for example, his whole approach was dictated by love of God, his desire to conform as closely as possible to the divine will and to follow the model of the Prophet Muhammad. In Ibn Arabi's case too, critical self-examination was subsumed within complete devotion to and remembrance of God. His focus was always, unwaveringly, God's unity and incessant self-revelation. The Meccan period of Ibn Arabi's life can be viewed as the fulcrum of his earthly existence. Born in Murcia in 1165, he spent some 36 years in the Muslim West, the Maghrib, and another 36 years in the Muslim East, the Mashriq, with about 3 years in Mecca in between. This 3-year period both connect and differentiate the two halves of Ibn Arabi's life. To give some idea of how cataclysmic his Meccan period was, let us recall how it was in Mecca that he met the youth with no name, through whose silent instruction he began the writing of the enormous Futuhat al-Makkiyya. It was in Mecca that his status as the seal of Muhammadian sainthood was confirmed in a glorious vision of the Prophet. It was in Mecca that he had the dream of the 2 bricks and his encounter with the Kaaba. It was in Mecca that love of women was first evoked in his heart by the beautiful Nizam, source of the inspiration for his wonderful collection of poems, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, and it was in Mecca that he first savored the pleasures of married life, marrying and becoming a father. His literary output during this time was also prodigious. Apart from the first chapters of the Futuhat, he composed the Ruh al-Quds, which includes stories of the saintly men and women he had known in the Maghrib, the Mishkat al-Anwar, one of the first written collections of Hadith Qudsi, the Taj al-Rasail, a collection of 8 love letters to the Kaaba, and the Hilyat al-Abdal. The adornment of the spiritually transformed. The Hilyat al-Abdal must rank as one of the most popular short treatises written by Ibn Arabi, as attested by the many copies to be found in manuscript libraries throughout the world. Its enduring popularity may be due to the practical nature of the text, addressing the methodology of the spiritual path in deep but accessible terms. As the author explains in his introduction to the work, it was written in response to a specific request made by 2 of his closest companions, Badr al-Habashi and Muhammad B. Khalid al-Sadafi, while he was in Mecca. They had asked him to write something for them, from which they could benefit concerning the path of the hereafter, Tariq al-Akhira. The Hilyat al-Abdal was written in the year January 1203 in Tā'if in the space of an hour, while on a visit to the tomb of the Prophet's cousin, Abd Allah Ibn Abbās. Ibn Abbās is one of the great figures of early Islam, Blessed with a prodigious memory and great insight, he was famed for his interpretation of the Quran. Ibn Arabi refers to him as one of the elite group of saints known as the singulars, Afrad. He also quotes Ibn Abbás's comment on a particular verse in the Quran regarding the seven heavens. If I were to explain its true meaning, you would stone me for being an unbeliever. As we shall see later, the mention of the heavens is not so unconnected or insignificant in connection with the particular kind of saints known as Abdal, the substitutes or the spiritually transformed. Just as Ibn Abbás expounded the meanings of the revelation of the Quran, so Ibn Arabi in this treatise explains the meaning behind a revelatory incident drawn from his own experience. It is therefore fitting that at Ibn Abbás's resting place, Ibn Arabi should have been inspired to expound upon the spiritual discipline that truly frees man into a different world, and those who are masters of it. In his introduction, Ibn Arabi explains the reason behind his writing of this treatise. I have written this booklet for my companions and entitled it, The Adornment of the Spiritually Transformed, and those spiritual knowledges and states that manifest from it. Hilyat al-Abdal wa ma yazaru anha min al-ma'arif wa al-ahwal, that it may be for them and others of some assistance upon the path to true happiness. In Ibn Arabi's writings, there are many different kinds of saint, wali. What they all have in common is the fact that they have been taken charge of by God by His helping them in their struggles against the four enemies, the passions, the self, the world and the devil, and the knowledge of these pillars is the knowledge spoken of by al-Muhasib. In conformity to the notion of seven Abdal, there are 7 sections delineated in the work. In the first, which mentions the writing of the text in response to the request of his 2 companions, Badr al-Habashi and Muhammad al-Sadafi, Ibn Arabi alludes to the contents by stating that this is a chapter that brings together the various forms of spiritual desire, irada. For Ibn Arabi, the term irada signifies a yearning in the heart, which he distinguishes elsewhere in 2 ways. A natural yearning which includes some kind of self-gratification, and the desire for the real, which is founded on unconditioned purity, ikhlas. It is this latter kind which forms the subject matter of the treatise. The second section then describes the various forms of spiritual desire, which constitute 4 basic conditions of the spiritual life: renunciation, giving up the pleasures of this world for the recompense of the next; trust, handing over one's affairs and choice to the Lord; aspiration, for states of closeness to God; and worship, devoting oneself to Him and striving. Yet in all these cases, there is still the illusion of self-existence. The renunciate, he says, abandons the world in order to be recompensed. The worshipper strives hard because he longs for closeness, and so on. Each of these aspects demonstrates the taint of an individual self-willed choice, inevitably at variance with the sheer divine purity, which the Prophet Muhammad referred to as God is, and there is not with him a thing. These 4 types are summarized as aspirants, muridun, and form the first group of people described in this treatise. Beyond these, he describes 2 other categories, where the human has been completely taken out of his own action or will. These are described as the people of the letter Ba and the people of the letter Lam. The first Ibn Arabi calls people of wisdom and gnosis, who know that God is the tongue by which they praise Him, the hand with which they take, and so on. The second are people of authority and true knowledge, who know that God praises Himself by their tongue, that God himself takes with their hand, and so on. Unlike others who believe that they praise God by their own selves, both these groups have realized servanthood, their utter indigence before God. But it is only the second, the people of Lam, who have penetrated to the fullest condition of realization, for they have relinquished the illusion of possessing not just their qualities and powers, but even their very selfhood. They know who and what they truly are. Both groups are known as verifiers, muhakkikun, those who have realized the interior meaning of things, people of the inner heart, and they form the second group referred to in the treatise. This section is completed by a 4-line poem hinting that the treatise was composed in a vision of clear insight, bayina, and a divine address, kitab. In the third section, Ibn Arabi recounts an episode from his youth in Al-Andalus, where one of his companions encountered one of the Abdal. During their rather shocking meeting in his house, Ibn Arabi's friend, Abd al-Majid bin Salama, is inspired to ask how the Abdal become Abdal, and is told that it is through 4 things: silence, seclusion, hunger, and vigilance. These 4 are then described in the remaining sections of the treatise, which ends with a poem of exhortation to one who desires the spiritual abodes of the substitutes. Thus, a personal anecdote is given universal significance. Ibn Arabi describes silence, seclusion, hunger, and vigilance as the 4 pillars of spiritual knowledge, arkan al-marifa. In describing them as pillars, Ibn Arabi is implying a direct equivalent or correspondence to the 5 pillars of the Islamic religion, arkan al-Islam, that is, the practices of the testimony of faith, shahada, ritual prayer, salat, almsgiving, zakat, fasting, psalm, and pilgrimage, hajj, the first equating to spiritual knowledge, marifa. It is also in correspondence with his notion of the pillars of the religion, arkan al-din, which he mentions as faith, iman, sainthood, wilaya, prophethood, nubuwah, and envoyship, risa'ala. The same 4 principles are treated at greater length and from different perspectives in the Futuhat, where Ibn Arabi discusses what can be done by an aspirant prior to finding a true spiritual master, and where he also recounts the story of his Andalusian friend. This text provides an interesting complement to the Hilyat al-Abdal, treating the same themes in the context of 9 spiritual principles. He mentions these 4 as some of the things to be practiced so that one becomes firmly established in the affirmation, realization of unity, Tawheed. He describes 2 as actions of commission, hunger and seclusion, and 2 as actions of omission, vigilance and silence. And as in this treatise, points out that hunger includes vigilance and seclusion includes silence. Interestingly, he specifies that according to the people of God, seclusion is the chief of the 4. None is in seclusion except one who knows himself, and he who knows himself knows his Lord. He has no object of contemplation except God, by virtue of his most beautiful names, and he is characterized by them in both his interior and exterior. Referring particularly to divine names that can have a negative connotation, the proud, mutakabir, and the one who enforces or compels, jabbar, he secludes himself from the likeness of these divine names, due to what they contain in terms of negative attribute. If someone is named by them or manifests with their properties in the world, man's reality is to be totally indigent, and one who is indigent cannot be self-important or proud. Yet further than this is the one who secludes himself from all the divine names, since they belong to God alone. Even though he may be dressed in the likeness of all the names, yet he prefers to rest in poverty and indigence. Such a one returns to his native land, which is absolute servanthood, and this Ibn Arabi considers to be the real place of man. He continues, the servant returns to his own special quality, which is utter servanthood, ubud, in which lordship does not compete. He is adorned, tahala, by that, seated in the house of his potential reality, not his existence in being. He observes the dispensation of God within him, and he is secluded from spiritual directorship, tadbir, in that. Here again, one may note how he makes a passing reference to what really constitutes the description of servanthood, such that adornment, tahali, describing the 4 pillars or rules in terms of how they are understood by the aspirant, murid, and the verifier, muhakkik. He speaks of them as a spiritual state, hal, and a spiritual station, maqam, and as bearing fruit in a particular domain of spiritual knowledge, marifa. All that is physical has its root in that, which is spiritual. All our practice is preparation, to bring us to a point where one allows the acknowledgement of the divine in all his fundamental and rightful height and glory, remaining in pure servanthood while he remains in full sovereignty. What is absolutely remarkable about this masterwork is how precise and all-encompassing Ibn Arabi's descriptions of spiritual practice are. He gives us, in the space of a few pages, enough material to contemplate and act on for a lifetime. Whatever forms of spiritual practice we may come across, they are forms or effects of these 4, if they have real validity, and every spiritual tradition knows of their efficacy. Finally, it is worth noting that the number 4 plays a significant role in Ibn Arabi's thought. Elsewhere, he refers to it as the most perfect number and associates it with the earthly, receptive principle, as opposed to the heavenly active principle. For example, the 4 sublunar spheres, the 4 qualities of universal nature, or the 4 categories of existence. In the Hilyat al-Abdal, the 4 pillars or exterior principles are the prerequisites for spiritual ascension. The pillars correspond then, in a certain sense, to the Isra, the overland nocturnal journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, accomplished by the Prophet prior to his ascension into heaven, Miraj, an Abrahamic spiritual journey from the place of Ishmael to the place of Isaac, a purification process that takes the seeker to a place beyond the 4 exterior dimensions. Only through the accomplishment of these 4, says Ibn Arabi, will the reality of the Abdal be known, the 7 representatives of heaven, who are described in the final poem as those of pure virtue and noble eminence.